Hello and welcome to the latest ITV News coronavirus podcast, What You Need to Know. And it feels as though it's been another turbulent couple of weeks, doesn't it? Trying to get the kids back to school, trying to work out how we get back to our workplaces and our offices, then a rise in cases of COVID and, of course, the new rule of 6 and what all of that means for family and our social lives. On top of that now, though, dire warnings about the economy, specifically around jobs, with the furlough scheme ending very soon and significant parts of our economy struggling to envisage how they might even operate in the future. There is now a massive alarm bell ringing about a tsunami of job losses. Latest figures, nearly 700,000 have already disappeared from the payrolls of British companies since March, and we're now witnessing the sharpest rise in redundancies since 2009. For the Tonight programme, our political editor Robert Peston has been assessing the state of our jobs market to look square on at what we're facing and where and how recovery might come and what it might look like. Great to see you, Robert. I suppose we should start really, and we talked a lot about this on News at 10, just give us a sense of the scale of this crisis in jobs.
Well, we started this crisis with the sharpest contraction in economic activity for something like 300 years. But because the government chucked an unprecedented amount of money at the problem, paying companies not to sack workers, the famous furlough scheme, and an assortment of other schemes to prop up businesses and employers, we haven't seen the kind of rise in unemployment that you would normally expect with our national income, initially contracting by a fifth or so. There has been a recovery since then, but our output is still something like 10% below where it was, which is, by all modern standards, an unprecedented contraction. We've seen, as you pointed out, a pretty significant rise in unemployment, but a fraction of what would have taken place if we hadn't had that support. And we are now, as you say, at this absolutely critical juncture because the furlough scheme is, in a matter of weeks, coming to an end. But the problem with making forecasts is it's not just a traditional economic forecast we have to make, it's also an epidemic forecast. And we're also at this period, this critical period, where we don't know the extent to which the spread of infection is going to rise again and what kind of preventative measures the government will be forced to take, and what impact that will have on the economy.
They always have to sort of do a coronavirus budget, don't they? When it's going up, when it's going down, how you then calibrate the economy around that. It is an extraordinary and, I know the word is overused, unprecedented sort of challenge, really, just finding how much support the economy needs when so much of the health question is unknowable.
Yes, so I think maybe the best way of thinking about this is to split it into 2 or 3 parts. There is, what do you need to do to make sure that the crisis, the economic crisis we have just been through, doesn't lead to what people call long-term scarring, which would lead to people being out of work for longer than they need to be. So that's one thing. Secondly, if there is a rise again in the virus, what can we do to limit that damage? But then there is this third absolutely fascinating issue. And I'm sure you'll have heard this from the people that you know who employ people, including our own bosses to an extent, which is that one of the things that this crisis has done has been to focus everybody's minds on how we work and on the technologies that are available to change the way we work. And one of the things you and I, I'm sure, have talked about many times is this whole, it's known as the fourth industrial revolution, all these digital artificial intelligence changes, which people thought over a period of 5 to 10 years was going to lead to massive changes in the way that we work. But because we've had this crisis, 5 to 10 years of changes is being, in a sense, concertinaed into, I don't know, a few months.
For some of us,
you know, and so, you know, we've all discovered, for example, some people like it, some people don't, that it is possible to do a lot of our traditional work, you know, over various different, you know, links, video links to colleagues from home. And, you know, we've all discovered that we don't have to go into the office to be productive in the way that we did. And this is just one small example of the way that, you know, and lots of people think that actually this would have happened, as I say, over 10 years. It's happening in a few weeks. And some of it may well turn out to be good for all of us. But my goodness, it's a shock.
And it's a shock for those jobs in particular whereby you can't work at home, actually. There is a whole body of our economy, a whole, you know, a swathe of our economy that is run by people whose jobs can't be done from home. So that's the big challenge, number one, out of that. Secondly, what I was really interested in, having looked at the programme that you've done, and you did this fascinating interview with Andy Haldane, who's the chief economist at the Bank of England. You go back to the scene of his childhood up in Yorkshire, where he, having witnessed what happened in the 1980s and that colossal industrial contraction with the whole of the political backdrop that went with it, of course, really spurred him on to try and find out how best to re-gear economies in challenging moments. I mean, can we look back to a period like the 80s when actually the unemployment rate was double what we're looking at now and learn any useful lessons from it?
So, as you say, in the 1980s, we had this long period of unemployment, over 3 million, and some people, you know, who lost their jobs in factories, in the mines, never properly worked again.
Well, whole communities.
You know, we started to, you know, we'd lived really since the Second World War in a period, you know, there were recessions, but, you know, broadly, we were living in a time of relatively full employment. And then suddenly, because of these extraordinary structural changes that Margaret Thatcher deliberately tried to make to our economy, whole industries closed down. And we began to understand this concept of the no-work family, which, you know, lives were blighted for years and years and years and years and years, whole communities, as you say. And actually, you know, arguably, many of those, you know, communities haven't properly recovered even
and in
today.
The political backdrop today, indeed.
You know, even today. And what I would say were the real problems in the 80s was we had a sort of fatalistic government that didn't feel that it was sort of the role of government to intervene and help people. Margaret Thatcher and those closest to her had this passionate belief in the, you know, the power of the market, is how they would have put it, and they just assumed that, you know, the market would provide. Well, it didn't. And, you know, what we have learned, and actually this was a sort of, you know, lesson that we, you know, cumulatively learned since then, is that there are quite a lot of good things that governments can do, but it isn't easy. And I think, again, just to sort of break it down, the two, there are sort of cultural things that have changed since the 80s, which might have something to do with the kind of governments we've had since then. And that is to do with the flexibility that people now show. So, you know, there were quite a lot of people, I think, in the 80s who, you know, of course they wanted to work, but they sort of, you know, I mean, look, I remember this. When I first got a job, I was surrounded by people who'd only ever worked in a particular company I joined their entire lives, and they were quite close to retirement.
And people there were whole family histories associated with businesses and...
Yeah, so people had this idea of a job for life. And so when the job for life didn't exist anymore, people didn't really know what to do. Now, some of them did end up in relatively low-skilled jobs, driving taxis and the rest. So one thing that's happened today, and I've met lots of these people in making this film, is there are lots of people out there who, when they see a shock like this, just think, I'm going to acquire a new skill. But here is the important point, it's a really important point, and this I think is something that actually curiously, back in 97, you'll remember, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair talking about this a lot. And it was a sort of dry run, but on a much smaller scale than what's needed now. They had a scheme to help people acquire new skills. That is something government can do. They can help with education. They can help with people getting new skills. This is something that this government is trying to do, but it is not a quick fix and it is hard. So what governments can do, and it's really important, is try and help people, provide the training, maybe through the private sector, and provide money to support people as they acquire new skills.
Do you think they'll do that? I mean, there is pressure. I mean, you look at other countries in the EU, for example, where they've already thought about extending the furlough scheme. We know that the Chancellor has come up with a Kickstart programme for young apprentices. We know there's been relief on business rates, etc., etc. There is clearly growing pressure now on the Chancellor to act further. How much further do you think he'll go?
Well, the Kickstart scheme is a very good idea. It's about encouraging companies to create additional jobs for younger people.
And it's important to say younger people are being disproportionately affected by this.
So younger people, again, one of the things we learned from the 80s, and I'm afraid, we've learned this from lots of downturns, is that in downturns, it is people right at the start of their careers who pay the heaviest price, because if you can't get your foot on the ladder for years, at a later age, you're on a lower salary, and it does, have a negative effect all your life. So it is really important to get these young people into jobs now, if we can. And it is a very frightening, very frightening time to be young at the moment, because there aren't that many vacancies. So a lot of people are now deciding they're going to go to university who might not necessarily have wanted to, and that gives them another perhaps 3 years. But it is difficult, and so we do have to hope that things like the Kickstarter scheme, and that's the most ambitious scheme they've announced so far, actually work. But they are hard, and they're hard partly because companies themselves are just struggling to keep afloat. So to ask a company to somehow think about how do you create another job is hard. Equally, quite a lot of companies are thinking about sacking people, and they're not allowed to take on somebody cheap and young if it's a replacement for a sacked person. And actually, there's quite a lot of monitoring to make sure that doesn't happen if at all possible. And then, we're definitely not going to talk at length about this, but there is a lot of uncertainty for lots of companies created by the fact that we don't yet know the terms on which we'll be dealing with the EU. We don't know what happens after the transition. So there are huge uncertainties for business right now. And so I do think that the government is doing many of the right things, but they are not quick fixes. And so to get back to something you were really implying, although the government constantly says no more furlough, and although furlough is incredibly expensive, and our national debt is rising, at a faster rate even than it did after the banking crisis, I don't think they'll be able to sustain that position, because I think if they, don't extend furlough, then unemployment will fairly rapidly rise above that 1983 million.
And to just look at the other end of the employed scale, young people disproportionately affected, but extraordinarily difficult if you are older, in your 50s, 60s perhaps, you lose your job at this stage, where do you find a way back? That is another real challenge in this, isn't there?
It is definitely anxiety-inducing, for wherever you are in the on the employment ladder, however old you are. It is true that historically it's been hard for those who are older and been doing the same kind of thing to find work. And there's another problem right now, which is over the last, 20 odd years, when you've had a jobs shakeout, what people have often had to do in desperation, not usually out of choice, is move down the skills ladder. So, you might have had a really quite a high-skilled factory job. Factory goes to China, and you end up working in a big supermarket, or you're driving a taxi, or you're in a call centre. Now, these are all, supermarkets have done pretty well because people need food, but in general, retail has been hit very hard, and almost inconceivable that retail will recover to where it was before for many years. So there aren't the jobs in shops. There are lots of taxi drivers already, and people are a bit wary about taking. So you can't really, as easily as you used to be able to do, go down the skills ladder. And going up the skills ladder requires, as we were saying earlier, support from the government
and
for
training
learning
and investment in it. So, actually, as a footnote to that, it's important to note that we don't just talk about jobs in terms of unemployment. It's actually the sort of jobs that are available for those who are able to get a foothold. Still,
and it isn't all about unemployment. One of the things that you and I, again, have talked about a lot over the last few years, was that after the extraordinary 2008 banking shock, unemployment, again, did not rise as fast as people would have expected it to do based on what happened in previous recessions. But that was because, people took 0 hours contracts.
The gig economy.
You got the growth of this very insecure, low wage economy. Now, many people would say being on a low wage is better than being unemployed. But again, let's not be in any doubt, lots of people were in work and in poverty, and throughout that period, the scandal, and this is still with us, and I fear it's going to come back a bit, perhaps a lot. The scandal was people working every hour of the day and still having to go to food banks. Now that was not much of a solution. You may be in a job, but if you're relying on a food bank, nobody would say a civilised society. That's right in a civilised society.
Let's look at what opportunities, I know it feels a difficult thing to gaze at, but what opportunities might arise out of this. If we get a vaccine, nobody's expecting this overnight, clearly, but if there is a vaccine, if there is a recovery, if we start finding ourselves in a better position within 6 months, for example, and that, acknowledgeably, that is, an optimistic situation to be in, where does the recovery come? And could we actually look at a situation where things could turn quite quickly for the better? Give us a note of optimism.
Well, look, just to be, I know it doesn't feel that way, but things have already turned, remarkably quickly. Just to repeat a point I made earlier, the economy initially shrank 20%.
Sure.
It recovered half of that very quickly. A 10% bounce is unbelievably fast. It's just, unfortunately, when you've got a 20% bounce, 10% recovery still leaves you, poorer, much poorer. And so, the issue is not whether we will recover. We will recover. The issue is whether what happens, and I think this is, for me, my second anxiety. My first anxiety is making sure that, we don't see the kind of pernicious long-term unemployment that, has blighted lives and communities in the past. It's vital. And we've talked a bit about how you would deal with that a bit. But the other thing that happened in 2008, which I worry about happening again, and we're already seeing evidence of this, to be honest, is we will see a further widening in inequalities, a further worsening in inequalities. You only have to look at a world in which, earnings are flat for most people, or in many cases falling dramatically, and the stock market is at record highs. And, that is because part of the recovery has been central banks, again, cutting the cost of money to nothing. And, when that happens, investors, pump money into places where they can, and tech stocks in particular, your sort of, your Googles and your Apples have just gone through the roof in terms of their valuations. Now, if you happen to be a tech entrepreneur or working in technology, you're in a very, very, very nice place at the moment. But equally, it just exacerbates the sense around the place, rightly in my view, that this is not a fair world. We're seeing a housing recovery deliberately encouraged by the government because they think it'll increase confidence and spending. They've more or less abolished. They've done this dramatic reduction in stamp duty to stimulate a recovery. But again, that benefits those who happen to own a house, not those millions of people who can't get on the housing ladder. So there's a lot of unfairness in where we are. And so for me, and again, it's just early days, we just don't know the extent to which, the government talks the talk. Boris Johnson's great phrase, nobody really knows what it means, but he keeps talking about levelling up. We know what we sort of get it as a general concept. We just haven't seen enough of the detailed policy to know whether he is capable of, essentially raising up the living standards of millions and millions of people who are currently very, very poor and getting poorer. So so the critical issue is not whether the economy as a whole will recover. It will, but it is the nature of that recovery that really matters. We live in a very divided society, and the really important thing is that we use this crisis to at the beginning of the crisis, in a social sense, we saw communities coming together, which I thought was one of the more uplifting things about what happened. But that feels now a bit like the past, and I'm just desperately worried that we're going to find ourselves back in an every person for him or herself world, and that would be bad.
Just as a closing thought, because I know that we could talk about this for such a long time because it's got so many ways and perspectives one can address the subject. But just from our audience's point of view, Robert, there'll be a lot of people listening to this who's perhaps have kids who are about to go into the jobs market or are already in that lower rungs of their career ladder. It'll be a lot of parents, and I include myself in this. So you thought you could sort of give your kids a toolkit with this is how you might think about navigating the world of work. How would you go about that, advising a young person? It's a massive thing for me to shove straight at you.
So look, but I have been, this has been something I've been sort of slightly obsessed with for years and years and years, and I don't think that what I thought about it, before the crisis is wrong in the middle and, in the middle of the crisis. And it is that what all of us have to be is we have to, we have to be humans, not robots, because, we are living in an extraordinary age where artificial intelligence, robots can do more and more and more of of the jobs that we used to do. An example I often give is that, and this was a conversation I actually had 2 years ago, but it's still relevant. Talking to the boss of a big accountancy firm, and what he said to me was what was worrying him was not whether artificial intelligence would lead him to sack vast numbers of his people. It was, and these were people who thought of themselves as being in safe middle-class jobs, it was, how fast it was socially responsible to do that. And, we are seeing a so-called hollowing out of, even now jobs that we thought of as being safe middle-class jobs. The things that robots, on the whole, can't do is they can't be creative, they can't be caring, they're not. Actually, we are. People. There's this stupid. Sort of insulting thing. Sort of thing thrown at people. Be a coder and obviously coding is an incredibly valuable skill. But actually, truthfully, computers can now do their own coding. Which is not to say I'm in any sense denigrating learning how to code, but what I am saying is, it's in the end, it is. We think, for example, and this is not supposed to make either of us feel comfortable, we think that people won't want to watch robots presenting the news. We hope, right? Because we think that's a human thing, and it's going to continue to be a human thing. And so I would say, think about. First of all, education matters, and the basics all matter. But think about how to learn. You've got to learn how to be adaptable, and focusing on those more caring, creative, human aspects of education, which I fear we have underplayed for quite a long time, sort of matters.
Root it in your humanity.
Yeah, something like that.
That's fascinating, Robert. Thank you very much. And it's a great watch, your Tonight programme, which is going out on Thursday, the 24th of September. Can we save our jobs? That's with Robert and myself at that time, on that date. Thank you very much indeed for tuning in again. You can catch up with all the episodes in this series and find out all you need to know in these challenging times. That's quite an offer, isn't it? On our website, itv.com/news. Until next time, from Robert and from me, bye-bye.